Hi, and welcome to the National New Teacher Support Podcast brought to you by New Teacher University. I'm your host, Dr. Terry Ross, and I'm also your principal. The National New Teacher Support Podcast is a podcast by teachers for teachers. And I'm so excited that we're kicking off our second biannual 30 Days to Wellness for Educators campaign. This is our spring campaign. We did our fall campaign between Labor Day and Thanksgiving because that's a time that things just get so busy. You can get kind of lost in translation or lost in the weeds during that time. And this one we're doing between spring break and May 1st because that's also a time of the year that things get really busy. Teachers and administrators are preparing for the end of year assessment. They are preparing for the end of year celebrations and promotional ceremonies. So it's a lot going on between that time. And we want to make sure that we stop and take care of ourselves as educators because I too am an educator first. And principals, we want to make sure that you're helping your teachers to be mindful of their wellness. So we're talking to principals, but this campaign is for all educators, and we want these strategies to be shared with our teachers. So thank you again for joining us on the National New Teacher Support Podcast, brought to you by New Teacher University. And thank you for joining us for our second biannual 30 Days to Wellness campaign for educators between March 20th and May 1st. And I'm so excited that I have experts joining me this year. Today, I have with me a psychotherapist, Genevieve Alao, who's the owner of the Corner Counselor. And she's going to be with us this year sharing strategies on Wellness Wednesdays as well as some other days during the week. But today, she's going to be on the podcast with us. And our topic today is Do You Have You? We're going to talk about self-awareness. And Genevieve, I'm so excited that you joined us and that you are one of our experts this year. So Genevieve, if you will introduce yourself and tell us about your journey to becoming a psychotherapist.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much again, Dr. Tara. Oh my goodness, it's amazing to be here, to be with you and with all the individuals that you touch and that you speak into on a day-to-day basis, and creating this awesome campaign, for them and them leaning in to take all the benefits and um, all the value out of it. So it's really great to be a part of this movement, and such a powerful movement it is. Um, I'm a registered psychotherapist. I have been counseling and walking and journeying with people for decades now. And I got into this really because of my passion for relationships. So right now, what I focus on is really emotional, mental, spiritual, and relational health with individuals, with couples, with families, with organizations, because I really do believe that relationships are the foundation of our well-being and our capacity to do well in this world. And so when we look at and our topic today, oh my God, I'm so excited about it. When we look at really what starts that process of building quality relationships and well-being, we start with ourselves, right?
Yes.
And so I love the topic that we're going to delve into today. I know you told me to talk about myself, but it's always a challenge to do so. Um, but maybe what I'll say is this: my passion is certainly for making sure we as individuals are cultivating great relationships with ourselves, and with God if we have a faith background, and with each other. And we do that first, of course, by starting with the fundamentals of well-being and taking care of ourselves. So here I am, and here you are. I'm
Yes,
excited.
and thank you so much. And you're on the right podcast because see, you are a teacher at heart. As educators, we spend very little time talking about ourselves. We get into the topic and teach it. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for sharing that because relationships are absolutely the most vital part of teaching because not only will new teachers have to build relationships with their students, they're going to have to build relationships with their colleagues, they're going to have to build relationships with their parents, with the administrators, and then the greater community, because so much influence comes from the community into the schools because schools are a reflection of what's happening in their community. So relationships are absolutely the foundational piece. So I'm so glad that you're here with us today, and I'm glad to know that that's a focus of your everyday work in terms of your therapy work, building relationships with families and communities. So today we're going to talk about, do you have you? And the first thing we're going to talk about in terms of this self-awareness and do you have you is, how do we show up? Because sometimes we don't know what we bring to the room. Sometimes we're bringing so much value and we don't know that we're bringing value. And we need to know that because it'll make us value ourselves more. And then sometimes we'll show up in rooms and we may be the distraction. And if we're not aware of that, we don't know. So talk to us, Genevieve, about how do we show up, and what should we be made aware of, and how we show up.
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the fundamental things, and you know, one of the things I think, just sort of as an aside, is that the climate of culture is changing, right? And so
Yes.
the things that we used to value, the things that we used to pursue, are not the things that are getting us what we want and need now. So, we talk about the pursuit of happiness. People are looking for meaning. They're looking for things that are going to fulfill them, right? And that's not found by certain, degrees and money and things like that. And so when we look at well-being and the fundamentals of relationship, we're actually talking about what is most important for us as a society, as individuals, as families, and as a global population right now. And so we have to really recognize sort of the shift towards um, relationships and well-being as a value system for us, and it's something that we lean into, right? And so just sort of laying the landscape for why it is even important for us to talk about what we're talking about today, and then also to look really closely at like how we do show up. And the question is a personal one. It is a very personal one. We have to ask ourselves how we show up. And then we have to be very honest about the answer. What happens with us, with others, when we enter into a space, when we open our mouths, when we look at people, when we speak to them, the words that we say, when our bodies are together, what happens, right? And if we're not taking stock or paying attention, we'll miss it, right? So when we show up, we're like, oh, here I am. I'm just me. I'm just who I am. And so, but it's more than that. It's okay. I'm showing up, and my tone of voice is a certain way, right? And I might say something to someone, and they might walk away discouraged. They might walk away down. They might walk away perplexed. They might walk away confused. But if we're not paying attention, we won't notice that. We won't notice how we come across. And so the question becomes, okay, how do I show up based on the reactions that I'm getting, based on my internal motivations and intentions, right? And so if I want to show up in a jovial manner, or I want to show up and I want to make people feel good, right? I want to show up and I want to make the children feel good. I want to make my staff feel good. I want to make my colleagues feel good. I want them to know that they're empowered. I want them to be inspired. How am I going to show up? I'm going to show up in that way. I'm going to show up in an inspiring way, right? I'm going to come with an encouraging word. I'm going to come with a good attitude. I'm going to come with a positive mindset. But if I don't ask myself the question, I may not be as intentional about planning my way of showing up. And then I have to ask myself, if I'm not showing up the way that I want to show up, what do I need to change? And so if I show up in a space and I want there to be calm, I want there to be an atmosphere of learning, I want there to be an atmosphere of inspiration, whatever the case might be, especially as educators, right? We're looking at feeding the minds of the individuals that are in front of us. We're really looking at giving them experiences in learning. We're giving them capacity to expand, right? And so if I'm entering the space and that's really what I want, but my students are walking out like, oh, I'm bored. I'm not engaged. I don't care. I'm not motivated. Then we have to really look at what we're what we're giving off, right? Because then we're not hitting the mark. We're missing the mark. And so what then do we need to do for ourselves, within ourselves, in order to show up the way that we really want to, right? And it's a personal question, and it's a personal quest. And sometimes it's challenging because we've been so ingrained in what we've been doing,
Yes.
who we are. This is just the way I am. And we don't necessarily always accept or maybe even know that we can do some things to tweak the way that we are showing up so that we show up as we want, right? And of course we have to have a value system before that, because a lot of us talk about matching energy, and I'm just going to show I'm going to show up the way that they show up, and I'm going to do with it. That kind of stuff doesn't necessarily work when it when it comes to personal decisions about the way that we want to show up. So we have to make decisions.
Yes. Thank you so much. You just shared so much. And excuse me, you said we have to show up as we want. And when you first started, I wrote down the word intentional
Hmm.
because you talked about being intentional and show up as we want. And you talked about that we have to look at what matters because our values have shifted.
Yeah.
And the pandemic did give us a lot of time to think. It gave us time to figure out who are we away from the hustle and bustle, and how do we fit into our homes and our families, and just how do we fit into ourselves. So I'm so glad to hear you talk about that we can show up as we want, because what I'm finding out is that feelings are established by an emotion.
Mm.
And it's not just who we are, because we can shift an emotion.
Hmm.
Because you start off get sad, or if you're really sad, jump in a cold shower and see, do you think about being sad? Your body's going to go into like what's happening mode, and you're not going to be sad anymore. You're going to be excited. You're going to be like, what's going on? And you're going to kind of almost be in a survival mode, but I can guarantee you won't be depressed.
Mm.
So we can definitely shift our emotions, and if we can shift our emotions, we can shift our feelings, and we can show up as we want. Now, you're the therapist here, and people always have said that we cannot hide our true uh, emotions. Like if we're really angry and we show up, and they say, well, your children can pick up on that. So it's honest, it's best to kind of like be honest about how you're feeling, but at the same time, show up the way you want to show up, and then your children will understand, your students will understand those little subtle shifts. You know how sometimes you're around people and they say, something a little off about you today, and you think that you have done your best to hide all of those things, but they can pick up on it
Yeah.
because they know you. And that's the way children are in the
Yes.
classroom. They know their teachers, and they can pick up when something is off. So
Yeah.
thank you for sharing all of this, that we can show up as we want, and that we can lean into how we're feeling. We
Yeah.
can lean
Absolutely.
into that, but also we can shift and be intentional
So
and
maybe
ask ourselves, what do I need to change?
yeah, and I think you have a good point there when you make the distinction between our feelings or our emotions and how we show up. How we show up is our behavior,
Oh, yeah.
right? So those are actually two different things. We can feel a way and show up a different way. So just because I feel angry, and it's also a mindset thing, because our experiences tell us what we ought to do in response to our feelings. So if I grew up in a household where people were yelling and cursing and screaming and all the things, then I might believe that to show up angry or to express my anger, I need to, yell and curse and scream. But that's not actually the case. That's a behavioral choice. So I can be
Yes.
really angry, I can be really upset, and I can say to you, "Hey, Dr. Terry, I'm really upset right now. I'm upset because ABC happened, and I'm going to hold that upset. I don't need to yell and scream and curse because I feel upset. Two very different things. I can choose to behave in a manner that is conducive to the environment that I'm in right now. And the
Yeah.
environment that I'm in requires for me to teach, to engage, to be present, to, whatever the case might be. And I can hold my emotion because I'm a human being. That's where I regulate, right? I get to
Yes.
decide to turn up the dial, to turn down the dial, that kind of thing when it comes to my level of emotional expression and the placement of my emotional expression, right? And so Aristotle has this wonderful quote. He says, "To be angry is easy, but to be angry in the right place at the right time, for the right purpose, with the right person, to the right degree, all of that, that's challenging, right? Because it requires, here's the word, self-control,
Yes.
right? And emotional regulation is an adult maturity thing. That's a thing that we have to grow in and continue to cultivate. And so I hear you, and I love that distinction, because we are responsible for our behaviors. We are 100% in control for choosing our behaviors. Our emotions are a different thing. Anything can trigger a fear. I can go outside there and, see a dog. I got bit by a dog when I was 3 years old, and oh my God, I'm scared. But it doesn't mean I need to run for the hills or run screaming. I can be scared
Yes.
and be calm,
Yes.
right? The behavioral response is my decision, right? And so we have to make distinctions between that feelings behavioral space, and take accountability for how we actually show up.
This was so good. It's a choice. Thank you for sharing that. And it's always been a choice for us. So I know we can keep talking about this, but let's move on to the next piece of, do you have you? Do you have you? What are you carrying when you show up? What are we carrying with us? So when you say, what are we carrying? What do you mean by that, Genevieve?
Yeah. Yeah. So sometimes we are so I don't know if you the best image I can use for this is an iceberg. I don't know if you've ever seen an iceberg. An
Yes.
iceberg has like a large portion underneath the surface of the water, and then lesser degree, a smaller portion on top of the water. And the larger portion anchors the iceberg. And so we see less of the iceberg than the actual iceberg. And that's kind of like us, right? So we display and people see or perceive a lot less of us actually in existence. And we are also aware of less of us than is actually in existence. And so we're much more than the sum of our parts. And so when I say what are we carrying, we're looking at all of the things that are subconscious, beneath the surface of ourselves, that are impacting or influencing what comes out of us, what we show others, what other people see and hear and know and experience of us. Okay. And so part of the work of self awareness, right? Do you have you? Part of the work is getting a chance, giving ourselves time, taking doing the effort, the work, um, to get to know some of what is beneath the surface that is either trying to hijack our progress, that's affecting us in ways that we don't like and we are not satisfied with, and that other people don't like. People show up and they tell us, you have an attitude, you have a resting this face, and you look grumpy and miserable all the time. That's the stuff that's beneath the surface, right?
Mhm.
It's like we got to get down there and start doing some of the work to find out, hey, what is it that we are carrying that is coming out in ways that we don't like? And that could be going back. I mean, I'm a whole therapist. I do family systems work. And we go back a lot to our families of origin and some of the original like models, some of the original learnings, some of the original messages, that we've we've been given, and that we've made sense of. So that's been our norm. If you come out of sort of a, a calm environment where there was no fighting, there was no conflict, well, you're probably carrying sort of a schema about the world, right? It's like, well, everything kind of works out, everything's kind of fun, everything's okay. And then when we meet up with real conflict, we're like, whoa, what just happened? And I don't have the tools to deal with this because I didn't get them. Right. And so there are different ways that we can, sort of mine or dig into what we are carrying and how it's affecting us today, especially in how we build relationship. If you were told, I know, there's a saying, and my mom used to say it, children, no, my aunt used to say it, children must be seen and not heard. Children must be seen and not heard. And I heard that growing up. And so it was very difficult for me to learn how to speak up at school, to ask for help, to ask questions. I was in grade 2 and grade 3, and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing here, but I didn't feel comfortable asking questions, right? So it's something to note that we learned things in our growing up years, and we develop, beliefs about what we've heard or what we've learned, the scripts and so on, and we carry them with us. We carry them with us, and sometimes we need to go back and be like, hold on, what am I actually carrying, and how is it impacting my capacity to do life well today, to do life and relationships well today? Do I express myself? Do I say what I really mean? Am I afraid that people are gonna, be upset with me or whatever. Like, where's that stuff coming from that's really holding me back? Right. And
Yes,
so, yeah, it's good. It's important to know what we're carrying. And sometimes there's trauma and there's a lot of, adverse things and stuff that might require deeper work. Um, but just, the intention has to be there to know what we are carrying. Yeah.
absolutely. Thank you for that because there is so much underneath this iceberg.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, what we don't recognize is that we sabotage ourselves with the things that we're carrying because we don't know it. I'm reading a book called The Big Leap, and it talks about upper limit problems, where people bring things out of childhood that they create upper limits for themselves. And no matter how far they try to go, if they don't build their self worth, to where they're trying to go, they'll sabotage themselves every time at the limit that they think they should be at. So thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that piece that we really have to take time for self-reflection to see what's packed underneath us. Why do we do certain things? Because as an educator, and I've spent most of my career in administration, and I had to unpack some things with me because there were some things that I bought out of my childhood. And some of it was, most of it was good things that I bought out of my childhood because I grew up in a large family. I thought all of my big brothers, I was the youngest, and I thought all of my big brothers were strong. I thought all of my sisters were beautiful and smart. And I just felt like the world was built around love. In our home, you did not, this thing where people crack jokes and talk about each other. We weren't allowed to do that. We had games. So my mom chose that we do organized things like we played Yahtzee and Monopoly and things like that. We had a basketball goal, but you could not sit around and make talking about each other a pastime.
Wow.
So as I get into the world and so many people are into that and then, oh, it's just a joke. Well, I don't know how to adjust to you saying, I guess, mean or crazy things to me. And it's supposed to be a joke.
Hmm.
And then when I say something back, I'm being defensive or I say it too much. And maybe that's because I don't have a skill set for talking about people. I talk about ideas
Hmm.
and ways to make things happen. So I know that I bring that to the room. So a lot of times I detach in those conversations and I had to learn how to do small talk because everything for me was business. Everything for me was transactional. We were doing some things. So, and not in terms of like, how are you doing and how's your family? Yes, I understand that piece, but to carry that conversation on, that was a skill for
Yeah.
me to learn how to sit and maybe have 20 minutes of getting to know you conversation before we delve into business. So, what are
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
carrying with
And so
us? And
there, the piece there I want you to know is that you leaned in and learned. Like you said, hey, I didn't grow up with this. This is not my norm, but I recognize the value of it and that I need it, and
yes,
I'm going to do it. Like,
absolutely.
right? Look at the trajectory. You're like, whoa, I need something. I want something. I see the value of something. I'm going to lean in and learn how to do it. And you did.
Yes, one of my assistant principals told me this was in maybe 2004. She said, once the conversation is over, once people start into the small talk, she said, you'll just walk away. And I was like, do I? She said, yes. And so
Yeah.
I didn't get offended by it. I had to learn, okay, you stand around, you talk a little longer, you listen and become interested in the other person and not just the task or whatever. And a lot of that had to
Yeah.
do with me being so young, getting into administration, that I wanted to make sure that I was always appropriate. So I didn't stay around to do a lot of the small talk stuff. But yes, thank you so much for sharing that. What do we have packed underneath us? Because as a leader, you do need to know how to stand and talk to the people around you in order, and you got to get to know them and be genuinely interested in who they
Yeah.
are and what they have going on in their lives beyond the work that you're doing on a daily basis. So the last thing we
Yeah.
discussed in Do You Have You is how do we identify blind spots? What are our blind spots? And first of all, what is a blind spot?
Hmm. Yeah. I think maybe a basic definition would be a blind spot is an area of yourself that you are not aware is hindering. your capacity to function well or to function at the level that you desire. Okay, so a blind spot can be anything in any area. It can be related to your work, right? And so maybe you require, some technological training in order to function better in the classroom and to make better presentation, right? So that would be a blind spot, maybe, whatever. But there are blind spots in terms of our character, in terms of our personalities, in terms of our capacity in relationship. A blind spot for you would have been your dislike or perhaps inability,
Yes.
incapacity for small talk. And for somebody to point that out, because we're in community with other people, we're in relationships with other people, right? So
Yes.
your colleague would have been able to observe that, comment on that, right? Share that with you. And then you're
Yes.
like, oh, yeah, that's a thing. Um, and then also offer you an opportunity, right? Hey, you can actually develop better relationships if you learn how to do some small talk, right?
Yes.
So spots are areas that we don't necessarily see or we don't necessarily see as a hindrance to us. So we don't see necessarily how getting past or through or learning through that blind spot can get us something better.
Mm.
Okay. And so when it comes to like character development, we look at skills, yes. We look at relationships, yes. And then we look at personal understanding, personal self awareness. We look at personal, that's not the word I'm looking for. I'm looking for the word sense of self,
Mhm.
right? And so you talked about the cap. If we have a lid, we self sabotage. If we think that we are only worthy of a certain level or a certain, you know, um, a certain thing, then we will self sabotage. And the blind spots are usually most detrimental when it comes to ourselves and how we see ourselves, right?
Yes.
And so part of being an educator, and it's funny because I did used to teach. I didn't teach children, but I taught in post-secondary education. So I taught adults or teenagers. Um, but I think so much of the way that they see themselves came out in their work, came out in their pursuit of education, came out in what they thought they were capable of doing. And I think I mean, yes, we teach curriculums and we teach information, but learning how to spot a blind spot for ourselves um, would look like reaching out to others. It would really look like leaning into trusted individuals. It would look like asking. It would really look like that,
Yes.
and being comfortable enough, not just to ask. We have to get there first. First of all, we have to even want to know.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
that's
Yes.
that's
Yes.
a big thing too. I mean, some of us don't even care. Some of us are just like, whatever. I'm gonna be who I'm be. This is me. I'm gonna just do me. Some of us really come across like that, and we don't really care about improving or growing. Um, so we have to get there first, but we also have to be willing to ask others, and then
Yes.
we have to be willing to hear the hard answers. We have to be
Yes.
willing to hear the hard answers. Like
Yes.
I'm a very different person today than I am, I was 10 years ago. And I remember doing this kind of work where I asked trusted friends, like, how do you guys actually experience me? How have you experienced me over time? And what do you think are my biggest hindrances? And they didn't hold back. They 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 were very honest. Let's say, and ask people that love you because they're not trying to tear you down. Um, but they were very honest about how it is that I showed up, and I didn't like what I heard. I didn't like what I heard, and I had to lean in and start doing the work because if I wanted to align with my own value system and how I wanted to show up in the world, well, I had to do the work to get there. So spots, listen, your loved ones, they'll tell you. If you have a spouse or you have kids, they will tell you if you ask them, and they will be honest with you. Um, and then you can start doing the work. And I think, even as I say that, sometimes we have inclination, like inside, we kind of know some of the areas that aren't necessarily helping us, right? Sometimes we're aware, we just don't we either don't have the capacity or we don't take the time um, to really face it because it's a hard truth. Right? So Yeah, I think those are some things that we can really think about when it comes to blind spots.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing that. One of the things that you talked about, the 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 blind spots in doing the work once you know about them. Do you care enough? One of the things that I looked at with blind spots, some people have blind spots that they are aware of, but they don't know how it's impacting them. Like I would hear people say, I'm not a morning person.
Hmm.
Well, you know you're not a morning person. However, you're blind to how it's impacting your relationships on the job.
Woo!
You're blind about how it's impacting your
Right,
relationships in your home.
right.
And it's also a choice
Yeah.
because well, don't talk to me until I get my coffee. Well, we may have some business to discuss before your coffee,
Hmm.
and it may impact 1,500 people.
Wow.
So
Wow.
how do we know? We know that we're this way, but we're blind to how it's impacting other things in our lives. What advice would you give people like that, or people who are around folk like that?
Whew. Yeah, so that's so good. So when it comes to personal preference over purpose preference, there's no real way to change that in an individual. You are responsible for yourself. We can't control
Yes,
other people, unfortunately. There are policies in place for sure to govern how we behave, especially in institutions in education, the education system. But when it comes to personal preference over purpose preference, you can't shift that in an individual. The individual has to see the greater purpose that they are a part of. And if they don't want to participate in that, um, eh, it's unfortunate. There's really nothing that anybody else can do. Um, and I say that outside of creating initiative campaigns to reinforce the importance of individuals within the system, right? And so we do have campaigns, and we stir up engagement and things like that. This is what you do. This is part of your work, right? This is part of New Teacher University. What you're doing is you're creating space, creating campaigns, creating motivation for individuals to lean in, to participate in a movement that creates purpose, right? The purpose of
yes,
this thing, the objective of this thing is bigger than one person. It's bigger than your coffee. It's bigger
yes,
than your waking up at whatever time
yes.
in the morning because you're tired, right? And people lean into movement. They recognize that there's greater purpose and they can be a participant in that. But at any given point, if they decide that they don't want to, there's really nothing that anybody else can do, right? And so
Absolutely.
we have to decide. We have to make it a decision on our part. Hey, do we want to be a morning person or do we want to be a person of purpose? Like, do we want to participate in this movement and be part of something greater than ourselves, or do we want to sleep in for a few extra minutes and make sure we get our coffee and be grumpy until then? You know what I mean? It's like, do you want to have a great relationship with your spouse, or do you want to, I don't know, ignore and your family, or do you want to ignore them until you get your coffee? Like, what is the greater good? What is the greater purpose? At your funeral, are they going to say, well, my dad, he didn't talk to me before he had his coffee in the morning, and I really wanted to,
Yes,
like, is that really the testimony that you want? You know what I mean?
absolutely.
It's kind of like, okay, what are you really focusing on at this point in time? In life, what's really important to you.
So thank you so much, and thank you for joining us for our 30 Day to Wellness campaign. I think this is just an absolutely wonderful podcast to kick off with. And teachers, we want you to know, educators, that our 30 Day to Wellness campaign is so that we can shine a light inside to look at how are we showing up and how are we taking care of ourselves. And we here at New Teacher University, we want you to know that we value you, that we need you, and that we want more for you. And one of the ways that you can have more for yourself is by focusing on your wellness, focusing on your health. One of the things about me, if I'm not talking about health, wealth, which is all to me bundled inside of education, I'm really not talking a whole lot. So I will work on that, Genevieve, and that small talk thing. So, teachers, again, thank you for joining us for our 30 Day to Wellness campaign. Again, we value you, we need you, and we want more for you here at New Teacher University. So, that's why we're focusing on wellness. So, we're so glad to have an expert with us today, a psychotherapist, Miss Genevieve Alao. Do you have any closing words that you would like to share with us here at New Teacher University?
I just want to say thank you again for having me and for allowing me to be a part of the movement, to participate in this great initiative that you have going for educators across the globe. I mean, this is a movement, and I think we really need to lean into how valuable and how important this movement is. We need to be well so that our families can be well, so that our education systems can be well, so that our communities can be well. It starts with us.
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us on the National New Teacher Support Podcast brought to you by New Teacher University. I'm your host and principal, Dr. Terry Ross, and thank you for joining us today. And our topic was, do you have you? How do you show up? What are we carrying with us when we show up? And what are our blind spots? So we hope that you enjoy this podcast. And thank you, teachers, so much for what you do on a daily basis for our students, because even on your worst day, you're still some of our students' best hope. So thank you, thank you, thank you for joining us on the National New Teacher Support Podcast brought to you by New Teacher University.